Well, thank you all for coming. Can you hear me all right? Yes? And I'm not in front of that. No, I'm below it. All right. First of all, I'm going to say some introductory remarks. Then I will say a little bit about key representations of Christabel and then come in to look at her life. Now, when she died in 1958, age 77, you find a lot of wonderful tributes to her, particularly to her suffragette days when she had been chief organiser of the Women's Social and Political Union, the most notorious of the suffrage groups campaigning for votes for women. And she co-led that with her mother, Emmeline. She was a key leader there because she was the strategist of the WSPU, and she was also very graceful. She'd done ballet as a young person, good-looking, brown hair, all curly, and you find in the obituaries they all mention how attractive she was, which always intrigues me. And she was then what we would call a celebrity, right? She was considered so important that in 1936 she was made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire by the British state. Yet despite her OBE and these favourable obituaries, she's not had a favourable press. So I'm going to say something about that first of all. I'm going to look at two sources that are very critical of her. The first one is the book by her sister Sylvia, The Suffragette Movement. That's an original copy of it, a signed one I have, that came out in 1931. Now, Sylvia, as most of you know, was the socialist feminist, and she offers a very hostile picture of Christabel, her elder sister, and their mother's favourite. And memories of Sylvia's jealousy about Christabel, you find, float throughout the text, shaping it in particular ways. Sylvia wanted to ally the WSPU to the socialist movement, but Christabel didn't. Christabel wanted to keep it separate from affiliation to any of the men's political parties. Further, Sylvia disliked the undemocratic nature of the WSPU, and in 1913 she sets up her own East London Federation of the Suffragettes. But since she allies the East London Federation to the socialist movement, the elder Pankhurst expel her from the WSPU in 1914. So these life experiences of Sylvia shaped the writing of her book. And so when we read it, you must always remember she writes as a less favoured daughter, a jealous sister, and an angry socialist. And once you've got those three things in your head, you will understand the content of it a lot better. And furthermore, in the suffragette movement, you find Sylvia presents herself as the heroine of the movement who brings about votes for women. So it's not her mother, it's not Christabel, it's her. It takes a very close reading of it. She also presents Christabel as being elitist. She condemns her because she says Christabel only wanted to bring in middle and upper class women into the WSPU, and there were very few working class women who joined it. She presents her sister as autocratic, lacking in warmth, and a feminist concerned only with a single issue campaign, that is the parliamentary vote for women. Now, I've done a lot on that, and I keep reading and rereading this book and finding new things, but the main point I want to make is it's become the dominant narrative, not only about the suffragette movement, but also about the Pankhurst family. And even 6 weeks or so in The Guardian, there was a letter signed by a whole group of left-wing people saying this is the definitive account of the suffragette movement. It isn't. It isn't. I did write a letter in, but they didn't publish it. So what I'm saying is that a left-leaning women's history, and I would put myself in that category, has accepted uncritically, I think, this book. Right, so that's one source. The other source is this dreadful book by David Mitchell called Queen Christabel, which I regularly throw around my study. and I often tell my students, you know, that the covers come off it, published in 1977, and students are quite amazed that it was published then, and it's so nasty in tone. It's sexist. It's written from a masculinist perspective that mocks and ridicules Christabel and sees her as a calculating lesbian who even had incestuous feelings for her mother. And if that's not bad enough, he also says that Black Friday, the 10th of November 1910, when suffragettes were very harshly treated by the police as they tried to push the women back from coming into Parliament Square, he said the women faced the hazard of rape, and wasn't that really what they wanted? So do have a look at it sometimes, that book. It's quite cheap now on eBay. Get it for about £3, so you only need to look at a few chapters or a few pages even to realise what it's like. I mean, in the last chapter, he talks, it's titled Bitch Power, because he can't cope with second-wave feminists, right? All right, so I'm not going to say too much about that because it's such a dreadful book. All right, so she's had a bad press. So what I do in my biography is to challenge these narratives because I was never happy with them. From what I'd read on the primary sources, I never developed this picture of Christabel that Sylvia writes. And so I've looked at a lot of primary sources that are new, particularly that were in the Jill Craigie archive, now in the Women's Library, and I place Christabel within a network of supportive female friendships. I take a sort of feminist approach to biography writing. And I think that kind of approach helps to explain the apparent complexity of her journeying from being a suffragette leader, someone who stands for Parliament, and then converts to Second Adventism, that is, someone who believes in the imminent second coming of Jesus Christ. So she's got an interesting trajectory. Right, so let's go through her life then. Growing up, as you probably know, in Manchester, she was born in 1880 to radical parents, Dr. Richard Pankhurst, a barrister, and his much younger wife, Emmeline. Emmeline was about 20 years younger than Richard. And this wonderful story, I always like to tell it, where she went to a meeting where Richard was speaking. She went to a meeting with her parents, and he steps out of the carriage, and she sees this long hand coming over the edge of the window in the carriage with these long nails, and he sees her, and they fall in love, all right? So romance is there, a very strong emotional tie between them. They had 5 children. The 2 boys died, and the 3 sisters all became active in the suffrage movement. There's Christabel on your right, is that it? It's on my right, yes. The one in the middle is Adela, and the little one down there is Sylvia. And Christabel, who was very bright and who read early, she was the prettiest of the girls and quickly became their mother's favourite. And what transpires when you read Sylvia's account in particular is that Christabel was very much the older sister who looked after Sylvia, who had weak eyes and didn't read till she was about 7, and Christabel would read to her a lot. Now, it was particularly in their Russell Square home in London that the children were socialised into the radical politics of their parents, who supported progressive causes of the day, including women's suffrage. And the important point for us is that the children were not treated like children, they were treated like little adults. So there was this continual interaction between the parents and the kids. And in Rebecca West's memorable phrase, she says the children bobbed like corks on the tide of adult life, and I think that sums up very well home life. Well, they moved back to Manchester, and their home life was shattered when Richard dies in 1898. And for a brief time, the very bright Christabel works in her mother's shop as an assistant, a job she hates, and she studies part-time at Owens College, which later becomes Manchester University. And there she meets Esther Roper and Eva Gore Booth and becomes immersed in feminist and socialist politics. And it's here she develops her skills as a speaker. Like the rest of the family, she joined the Independent Labour Party, but she soon becomes very critical of socialist men. She found that they spoke of sex equality, but too few were prepared to do anything about it. And as early as August 1903, she was voicing these concerns in the socialist press. She said, "It's not at all impossible to have tyranny with socialism. Working men are as unjust to women as those of other classes." So very early, she's developing a critique of socialist men. Then a few months later, that was in August 1903, she was saying that, a few months later, the Pankhurst women were all astonished when they heard that the hall built in memory of Richard and used by a branch of the Independent Labour Party would not admit women as members. So Christabel and her mother agreed that they had to establish an independent women's movement, which they did on the 10th of October 1903, when Emmeline called to her home at 62 Nelson Street, Manchester, a small group of women who were members of the ILP, and together with Christabel, they founded the Women's Social and Political Union. Now, it's an important organisation because it had three important features. First of all, it was to be women only. Secondly, it was to be independent of any political party. And thirdly, it was to be deeds, not words. So both Emmeline and Christabel had been members of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Society. They thought they'd achieved nothing during the years of peaceful campaigning, and they decided to set up this action-oriented grouping. Well, during its early years, as many of you may know, the WSPU engaged in peaceful campaigning, all to no avail. And Christabel particularly was very critical of this because she knew that women had been campaigning at least for 50 years for the vote. And she believed that women were too submissive and had to become more assertive about their democratic rights. And so on the 13th of October 1905, with Annie Kenny, who became her close friend, Annie was from a working class background, the two of them went to a Liberal Party meeting at the Manchester Free Trade Hall, where Sir Edward Grey was speaking. And when he gives no reply to their question, "Will the Liberal government give votes to women?" shouted out. When he gives no reply to that, they shout out the question again, "Unroll a flag." Well, you can imagine what happens. They're both dragged outside the room, where Christabel deliberately commits the technical offence of spitting at a policeman. And there was a lot of discussion about that. Was it a pout or was it a spit in the press? And in the police court the next day, both Christabel and Annie chose prison rather than pay a fine. And here they are, this wonderful photograph of them with their little banner. And I was intrigued when the Daily Telegraph had it on its front page, do you remember, in colour, on the 6th of February. Yes, I actually bought 3 copies because I was so impressed. They'd coloured it instead of it being black and white. Now, this is usually regarded as the so-called first militant protest. I mean, that word militant, I won't say too much about it now, but it really does need unpacking what it means. It was a brilliant tactic because what happened was that the press suddenly took notice of these women. Mostly the press condemned their slum behaviour, as they called it, but a lot of women came into the WSPU as members. And so what happens from here, from 1905, you get heckling of MPs being common, and also a willingness to go to prison for the women's cause. Well, during these early times of the WSPU, Christabel had changed her study programme at Owens College, and she was studying for a law degree. People often forget that, and she graduates in the summer of 1906. It was a very hot day that she graduated, and some of the young men in the audience shouted out, "Have you got your hammer?" And whatever, but they were cowed down. She gets a first-class honours degree in law then, and she wants to become a barrister like her father, but she's barred from training as a barrister because she was a woman. And that insult, personal insult to her, undoubtedly strengthened her feminist conviction that she had to do something about the unequal position of women in Edwardian society. And in particular, she thought that the sex discrimination that prevented women from voting for members of Parliament on the same terms as men was the key inequality that women faced, and that became her main aim in life. Well, in 1906, she moves to London as chief organiser of the WSPU, and she lives with the Pecketh Lawrences at Clement's Inn. You may know they were a wealthy socialist couple without children, and they treated her very much like a daughter. Emmeline Pecketh Lawrence was the treasurer of the WSPU, and she put its finances on a sound footing. In the building in which they lived, Christabel also had her office. And writing her biography, one thing that struck me was just how busy she was and about the long days she worked. For example, she had advised new members, she advised the district organisers, she had devised new strategies such as holding women's parliaments, because don't forget the parliament at the time was all men, and she'd deliver and write uplifting speeches. Among members who joined at this time, some of them may not be so familiar to you, as Hertha Ayrton. She was born in Portsea in Portsmouth, and later on she would become very important for taking in hunger-striking suffragettes who had been released and helping to nurse them back to health. Mabel Tuke was another person who joined about this time, and Mabel was another suffragette like Annie, who had a very warm friendship with Christabel that lasted into old age. Now, Christabel believed that the WSPU would only succeed in its aim if it became a national movement. And as noted earlier, she wanted to embrace women of all social classes and political persuasions. And so she continually reasserted this importance of the WSPU being free from affiliation to any of the male political parties of the day. So she developed this anti-party policy, anti-party, and that caused rifts, as you would expect, in the WSPU. And in 1907, some of the socialist women left to form the Women's Freedom League. Predictably, Sylvia, in the suffragette movement, calls the anti-party policy an anti-socialist policy. So you get this crossing over, this condemning yet again of her sister for that. And because Sylvia sees us as anti-socialist, she condemns Christabel as right-wing. Right, so you've got these tensions then mounting in the Pankhurst family. However, what you find if you go through the sources is that Christabel was regarded as the greatest living speaker of her day. You find a number of the commentators say that. She was skilled in handling a crowd, she was witty, she had this repartee. If a man interrupted her and said, "Don't you wish you were a man?" she would say back, "Don't you wish you were?" And all sorts of little witty things like that. These skills were particularly apparent at the Bow Street trial, and you can see Emmeline and Fred there, Fred Pecketh Lawrence walking with Christabel to the Bow Street trial on the 14th of November 1908. And this is a very important event in her life because she acts as the lawyer for the defendants, namely her mother, Flora Drummond, and herself. The women, these three women, had invited the public to help the suffragettes rush the House of Commons. And in a brilliant move, Christabel had subpoenaed as witnesses two cabinet members, Lloyd George and Herbert Gladstone, because they'd been in the vicinity of Trafalgar Square when the demonstration to rush the House of Commons took place. And if you look at the photographs at the time, Lloyd George and co, they look very shifty when they've been interviewed by this young woman here who always had these very graceful dance movements from being a ballet dancer. Well, the press loved Christabel, and they called her the Portia of the suffragettes after Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice. Well, as you would expect, all the women were found guilty, and Christabel and Emmeline had this photograph taken in their prison clothes. As you can see there, the arrows of the prisoners, and they're arm in arm, and they were always very close to each other. And Christabel says in a number of her letters that Mother and I always think as one, which I think is very interesting, but of course that wasn't helpful to Sylvia, who felt cut out of this relationship. Despite the setbacks of the Bow Street trial, Christabel continued to defend militant methods as the only way to win the vote. What she emphasised was that women had to develop their own backbone, their own consciousness about their rights, and to stand up and articulate, to demand what was theirs as a democratic right. And this is wonderful speech she gives in 1909, I think, which encapsulates a lot of this thinking, a lot of that thinking. She says, "Remember the dignity of your womanhood. Do not appeal, do not beg, do not grovel. Take courage, join hands, stand beside us, fight with us." And that sort of message hit a lot of women really in the heart, and particularly young women who found that they couldn't always get the jobs they wanted because of sex discrimination. In 1909, the government begins to forcibly feed imprisoned suffragettes who went on hunger strike. As you may know, they went on hunger strike because they wanted to be treated as political offenders and not as common criminals and placed in the 2nd and 3rd divisions in Britain. Well, all the leaders of the WSPU were horrified when forcible feeding was introduced, and they condemned it in the strongest terms possible. It was a brutal, life-threatening operation performed on women's struggling bodies. And it was doctors who pushed the tubes either up your nose and down into the stomach, a tube 3 or 4 feet long, or else clamped your mouth open and pushed a tube down. And many of the women experienced this as a form of instrumental rape of the body, although they don't use that word rape at the time, they use the word violation. Well, you find hunger striking, forcible feeding carries on throughout the suffrage movement, but the women still kept campaigning in peaceful, constitutional ways as well as more militant ways. And I thought you might like to see this photograph because of the hats they're all wearing, which are quite extraordinary, I think. Emmeline, as you can see at the end there, she has big feathers in something. Emmeline Pankhurst, I'm not quite sure what she's wearing, a sort of strange effort with feathers. Christabel's not wearing a hat there, and Mabel Tuke has this massive sort of hat you might wear for a wedding or whatever. I think it's a feather in it as well. So they keep on then doing this deputation to Parliament, trying to present petitions to Asquith, the Prime Minister of the day. For much of 1910, militancy remained suspended, apart from 1 week in November. In the January 1910 election, the Liberal government lost its overall majority and a conciliation committee was set up, which consisted of 54 MPs across the political spectrum, and they drew up 3 what they called conciliation bills of women's suffrage. However, all those bills failed to materialise. And this was a common theme throughout. Bills would come up to Parliament and they'd always been rejected by this male assembly. Now, why did they always fail to materialise? Well, I think there are 2 main reasons. First of all, the 2 main political parties of the day, the Liberals and the Tories, always sought party advantage from any suffrage measure. And they could never agree on the grounds of the legislation. So that's probably nothing new there. You may want to bring that up. The Parliament's still like that today. So the Tories wanted a narrowly based suffrage bill that would enfranchise only propertied women who were more likely to vote Tory. The Liberals, on the other hand, wanted a wider based suffrage bill that would bring in more working class women who didn't have property and who would be more likely to vote for them. So that's a key reason then why these conciliation bills never got through Parliament. The other key reason, and probably the major one, is that the Liberal the Liberal Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, was an ardent opponent of votes for women, and he was determined that no women's suffrage bill should be passed. And this was despite the fact that he continually gave promises to give facilities for a women's suffrage bill, but was always opposing it. And from what I've read, and you may be able to enlighten me a bit more about this, he seems to have been a little bit of a groper, because Baroness Trumpington, as she mentions in her book, that no woman was safe after dinner in a room alone with Asquith, or in a taxi with him. And after all this Me Too campaign, this makes me wonder about all this, but we can perhaps discuss that later. When the government broke another promise in November 1910 to bring in facilities for a women's suffrage bill, 300 suffragettes marched to Parliament, and they received unprecedented physical and sexual abuse as the police tried to push them back. This is the Black Friday incident I mentioned to you before. So breasts were pinched, skirts were pulled up over people's heads, the policemen put knees between the crutches of the women, some of them had black eyes, their hair was pulled, all sorts of things like this. And the women said to Mrs. Pankhurst, what is the point of us campaigning peacefully with all this damage to our bodies when if we attack property, the arrest would be quicker and we wouldn't get so bruised and damaged? And that is the key reason, a key reason, rather, why, in fact, from 1912 they began to damage property. Also by 1912 they were banned from attending Liberal Party meetings, so they couldn't protest there, and they were banned from holding their own. And so on the 1st of March 1912, the suffragettes struck without warning smashing plate glass windows in shops in London's West End. They would walk along the street, and in their muffs, don't forget this was the time of muffs, they'd hold a little toffee hammer inside, and then at the appointed hour, perhaps 5 o'clock, little toffee hammers would come out and smash the glass, and then you'd find the policeman come running with his whistle. Well, there were further incidents of window smashing after the 1st of March 1912, and the police decided to raid WSPU headquarters and arrest the leaders. However, Christabel wasn't there. She had been warned about what was happening by Evelyn Sharp, and also Fred Peckett Lawrence had played a part in that. And as arranged, she'd arranged this with her mother. She escaped to France because a political offender there was not subject to extradition. And she attempts to lead the WSPU from across the water. And that was only made possible, if you read all the accounts, because of the bonds of love, loyalty and friendship between her and trusted suffragettes such as Annie Kenney, Mabel Tuke, Grace Rowe, Jessie Kenney. And they come over disguised on the ferry, meet Christabel, and she gives writings to be published in next week's Suffragette. How on earth they understood her writing, I don't know, because I still have great difficulty with some of the words. But anyhow, they did. In 1912, October 1912, also there's a break with the Peckett Lawrences. Christabel had lived with them for a number of years, but now differences of opinion arose. Emmeline and Christabel wanted to escalate militancy. The PLs, Peckett Lawrences, did not. Emmeline was also concerned that he would be made bankrupt by having to pay out compensation for the damage to property. And so the Peckett Lawrences were ousted from the WSPU. Now, as you can imagine, the rank and file were shocked by that, but at a big rally at the Royal Albert Hall on the 17th of October 1912, Emmeline carried many people with her, and she was a very inspiring speaker, a great orator. And she has this wonderful speech that I still like reading, "Be militant in your own way." And she ends it by saying, "I incite this meeting to rebellion." I often feel like saying that a few times when I'm in a boring committee meeting at the university and it's going round and round in circles, but I don't, no. But I remember when Sarah Gavron came to see me early on about the script for the Suffragette, and I said the film Suffragette, and I said to her, do try to get in some of Emmeline's speeches. And what she did, I don't know if you've seen the film, I presume, when, what's her name, Meryl Streep is standing on the balcony, and you find bits of speeches here and there all put together in one, and if you know the sources, you know that not all one speech. Anyhow, Emmeline Pankhurst carries a lot of the suffragettes with her. However, the violence increases. It's not only damage to private and public property now, but also bombing and arson. But both Christabel and Emmeline give strict orders never to endanger human life. And you find that no one was killed, thankfully, because of this bombing. They were always to bomb empty buildings, and no one was seriously injured. Now, the WSPU had always wanted wider reforms than just the vote, contrary to what Sylvia says. This is very evident in a speech Emmeline Pankhurst gave in 1908, called The Importance of the Vote, where she says that women wanted equality in work, in pay, in the law, etc., etc. And now this aspect of the wider reforms that were necessary to change women's role become much more pronounced, particularly from Christabel, from late 1912 right up through to the outbreak of war. So Christabel leads a moral crusade, speaking out against the double sexual standard in a male-dominated society, where prostitution was rife because women were in a subordinate position. And as you may know, she wrote this little book called The Great Scourge and How to End It. And the Great Scourge, of course, was VD. And she has in there this slogan, votes for women and chastity for men. Well, you can imagine that wasn't very popular with men because it's bringing sexual politics into the bedroom. But her argument was that the subordinate position of women, whereby women couldn't usually get well-paid jobs, etc., forced a lot of women into prostitution. And of course, that was to do with the spread of VD. And men would often visit prostitutes and then go home and have sex with their wives, which meant a lot of the children as well were infected with venereal diseases. So you find this aspect of the suffrage movement then becoming very much more pronounced, as I said, from late 1912. Also, what's interesting for me is that you find in Christabel's rhetoric an increasing reference to religious sources. And she compares the suffering of the suffragettes under the tyranny of the Liberal government to the suffering of Christ and the early Christians. And she appeals to a high authority than the tyrannous Liberal government. And I've just been reading a lot of Emily Wilding Davison's writings, and she has the same rhetoric, very, very pronounced there. Well, as noted earlier, Sylvia is ousted from the WSPU in 1914, and Emmeline also decides that the unsettled Adela, also a socialist, should have a fresh start in Australia. So both the younger daughters are sort of banished. And why is that, you think? Is it a hard thing to do? Well, that both Emmeline and Christabel decided that this fundamental principle that the WSPU is independent from all men's parties must be preserved at all costs in order to maintain the unity of the WSPU. And that was above family loyalty. There's Christabel in Paris. I meant to show you that one earlier, which is quite a nice one. I bought that from Elizabeth Crawford for an exorbitant price. On the outbreak of war in August 1914, Emmeline Pankhurst calls a temporary suspension of militancy, and the suffragettes were encouraged to engage in war work as a way to win their enfranchisement. Christabel returns temporarily to England to a rapturous reception of the London Opera House, and she wears this flowing green dress. She often wore green, as I do actually. I just happen to like green. But she didn't stay long in Britain because she feared she could be rearrested. And so she travelled to the USA and Canada in particular, urging support for Britain's allies. Emmeline and Christabel now become very patriotic, and they rename the suffragette Britannia with the slogan, I don't know if you can see it there at the top, for king, for country, for freedom. And it's an interesting little journal. It's not only very patriotic, but it has these fierce articles written by Christabel attacking what she sees as the incompetence of the Asquith-led government. And what's interesting for me is the police frequently tried to close it down. You've got a repeat as with the suffragette. And these loyal women keep reproducing this little journal, often as a sort of little ragged thing with not even print. They keep producing it even in garages, in houses, in basements or whatever. And it's not until the hated Asquith stands down in December 1916 and is succeeded by Lord George that Christabel felt it was safe to return to England. When she returns to England, she finds that the women's cause is now in a relatively strong position, since the House of Commons has decided that a women's suffrage clause should be included in the forthcoming Representation of the People Act. Now, this made the WSPU redundant, and so in 1917 it is renamed the Women's Party. You can see it there, can you, quite clearly? And it's the same key circle of the inner WSPU: Mrs. Pankhurst, Treasurer, Honorary Secretary Annie Kenny, Chief Organiser Flora Drummond, Official Organ Britannia, and Christabel is editing it. Now, I've written a little bit on that because I think it's a very interesting grouping of people, which Sylvia, of course, condemned the Women's Party, saying it's not really a women's party as we would know it. Don't forget, this is still wartime when the Women's Party is founded, and so it supports the winning of the war, because Emmeline Pankhurst said, what's the good of winning the vote if we haven't got a country to exercise it in? But also what's really interesting about it is that it has this very strong feminist programme for after the war, which advocates equal opportunities for women in many spheres of life, equal pay, equal marriage laws, equal divorce laws, equal custody of children, setting up communal kitchens to take out of the drudgery of cooking. That's not a problem for me because my husband does all the cooking, so I let him get on with it, as he doesn't like me around the kitchen when he's there. So it was quite progressive in that way. 3 months later, after that is set up, on the 6th of February 1918, when Britain is still at war, success finally came on the women's suffrage issue when the Representation of the People Bill received the Royal Assent. And I think it was a very cautious measure because it had granted the vote to women graduates and to those women aged 30 and over who owned or had married into property. There was still this property qualification. Nonetheless, nearly 8.5 million women were franchised for the first time. It was an anticlimax for Christabel and Jessie Kenny, who sat huddled in their coats over a tiny fire that 6th of February. It was a very cold day. I don't think it was as cold as the day we had here 100 years later. But nonetheless, it did mean that sex discrimination against any women voting had been broken, so they rejoiced at least in that. And now Parliament quickly rushed through a bill to allow women to stand for election to Parliament, and Christabel decides to stand as a member for the Women's Party. And it's interesting to me that the Women's Equality Party, which has been set up recently, 2 or 3 years ago, it made no mention of this earlier party, and I wondered if they knew about it or not. Well, Christabel decides to stand as a candidate for the Women's Party in the working class constituency of Smithick, near Birmingham, and she loses by just 755 votes, so it was quite close. Interesting. And there's a photograph I bought of her and Flora Drummond campaigning in Smithick in 1918. You can see the fur muff there, which was so common in those times, and the furs around the neck and whatever. Well, by 1919, that's by about 6 months later, the Women's Party had simply faded away. And we may want to speculate on why that was so. Perhaps the appeal to such a gendered group was very limiting, and only women would vote for it, and then not all women would vote for it. But most of all, it had no money, it had no financial backing and further backing, and so it just faded away. Well, Emmeline was more upset than Christabel about the fact that her favourite daughter wasn't elected to Parliament. Christabel took comfort in spending time at a rented cottage in Surrey with her little adopted daughter, Elizabeth Tudor, or Betty, whom she loved dearly. And you can see little Betty there. Can you see her standing by the rocking horse? The little horse, push-along horse, isn't it? And those are the 4 little war babies that Emmeline adopted. I love that photograph. And the one on your right, Evelyn, she was the one I knew very well and was very fond of, and she died 4 years ago. And I remember interviewing her about 3 or 4 times. So Christabel took comfort then in looking after little Betty, and she also took comfort in her conversion to Second Adventism. The First World War had profoundly changed her, and she was seeking answers to the shattered international order, and she began to read avidly about biblical prophecy and thought she'd found an answer. But it was not until 1921 that she made contact with the chair of the Advent testimony movement, who had many contacts in North America. So over the next 30 years, you find that Christabel, until her death, becomes this enormously popular speaker, writer and evangelist for the second coming of Christ. And she was a popular speaker not only in the USA, but here in Britain. She wrote many books that sold well, and of course she had to earn enough to support herself and little Betty. In December 1927, while in England, she heard that her unmarried sister Sylvia had given birth to a baby son. He was to become Richard Pankhurst, of course. Since being a single mother in those days was considered scandalous, Christabel kept the news from her mother, fearing it would break Emmeline's heart. 4 months later, in April 1928, Sylvia went to the press with her story, telling the news of the world that her mother had not bothered to get in touch with her. The news deeply upset Emmeline, who was standing for Parliament as a Conservative candidate. But that was not all. Many people in the religious communities in which Christabel moved believed that the sensational news about the Miss Pankhurst mentioned on the billboards was in fact Christabel herself. And you find in her later letters how Christabel says that this haunts her even in her later life. Well, the incident broke Emily's heart, and she died 2 months later, just before the 1918 Act became law in July 1928. And many of the former suffragettes blamed Sylvia for her mother's death, but I think that may have been unfair in some ways, because Emmeline's health wasn't good after she'd endured these 13 imprisonments when she'd gone on hunger, thirst, and sleep strike. But you can see how the tensions within the Pankhurst family, in fact, shape the text that Sylvia writes, the suffragette movement, and how it's played out in particular ways in the politics. Well, in 1940, Christabel and Betty sailed to the USA to begin a new life. Neither would ever return to England again. And Christabel spent the last 18 years of her life in the USA, mainly living in the vicinity of the Los Angeles area on the sunny East Coast. She liked the generosity of the Americans. She writes about that quite a bit. And she liked the vibrancy of American culture. In addition to her preaching and writing, she did voluntary work, helping to look after wounded, traumatized young soldiers from the Second World War, and then later helping others who were sick or disabled. And she developed a reputation as a current affairs commentator and regularly appeared on TV. She also, for a time, had her own radio channel. So all this is quite interesting. Now, when she heard in 1953 that Sylvia had had a heart attack, she wrote a warm letter to her. And I always find this very moving. She says, "Sylvia dear, this is your birthday. and I am writing to wish you with my love many happy returns of the day. I hear that you are not as well as usual, and I hope that you are improving and feeling stronger in this spring and your birthday month. And then she finishes by saying, your sister Christabel. And so what happens then in old age between these two warring sisters is that they begin a correspondence which helps to heal, I think, some of the tensions. The final years of Christabel's life mainly preoccupied with her deep concern about the way suffragette history was being written. And she was particularly upset with the portrait of the movement that Roger Fulford drew in his 1957 book, Votes for Women. Don't forget Fulford had stood twice for election to Parliament as a Liberal MP. And so yet again that perspective comes into that book, and he's very critical of the suffragettes. Well, she writes a lot of these agonised letters. I find them quite sad to read, actually, to Fred Peckoth Lawrence's second wife, Helen Craigs, who had been the first love of Harry Pankhurst, the young Harry who died aged 20. So Christabel's writing to her saying, can't you do anything about Fulford's book? She's writing to Fred Peckoth Lawrence, and she's getting into quite a tizzy, I would say, about it all. And the issue is not resolved when unexpectedly she dies on the evening of the 12th of February 1958 from a heart attack. And it's remarkable, really. She was sitting watching television. So don't forget she was born in 1880. She's lived through all those changes, and she's sitting sewing, watching TV when she dies. Her manuscript of the suffragette movement, which she never wanted published during her lifetime because it would contradict Sylvia's, was published 1 year after her death. But by then, Sylvia's narrative of the suffrage movement had become the dominant narrative, rarely questioned. So what can we say in conclusion? What was Christabel's legacy? Well, she wasn't remembered for being a founder of the first independent women's political party, and she wasn't remembered for being one of the early women parliamentary candidates. What she was remembered for was for being a suffragette leader. Yes, she was autocratic, as Sylvia portrays her, but I think they all were. Emmeline was, and Sylvia was. But Christabel also had vision. She was a trenchant critic of male power, and she attracted women of all political persuasions and social classes into a separatist women's movement where they developed the power to speak out and articulate their demands. But that does not make her a Tory, as Sylvia claims. For Christabel, it was gender divisions in society rather than social class divisions that were the key dimension. And you find that a number of these former suffragettes who wrote about her in later life said what she did above all else was to put fight into women. She represented a different strand of feminism to the socialist feminism that shaped Sylvia's book. Christabel's feminism was a forerunner of the radical feminism which erupted in the women's liberation movement in the 1970s. It emphasized the power of men, the importance of women-only groupings, the importance of women developing their own consciousness, standing on their own 2 feet. And to find these different strands of feminism in one family, I think, is quite fascinating, because they are issues that still divide women today. And in particular, in this particular case, looking at Christabel Pankhurst and Sylvia's writing about her, we can see how those different kinds of feminism shaped the stories they tell. And this is a very important point to remember, since in a private letter written after Christabel's death by Sylvia to a friend, she says that it was Christabel who played the leading part in the suffrage movement, not her, as she claims in her own book, a 1931 book. And she said it was Christabel who made Votes for Women and the WSPU a worldwide publicity event. Right, I'll stop there. Thank you for listening.